Well, hello, I'm Ed Getty from the Real Estate Learning Group. I appreciate you joining us on our YouTube presentation today. I'm here with my partner, Geoff McLean. Jeff, say hello.
Hey, good morning, Ed. Good afternoon. Good whatever. Where are we today? Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I
afternoon,
think
actually.
yeah,
Uh,
Jeff McLean. Yeah, we're partners at the Real Estate Learning Group. We've been listing and selling real estate here in Maine for over 40 years. It's interesting. I was just looking the other day, Ed. You and I dug out, I should have brought it with me today. I dug out my Rookie of the Month pin that you and I got back in 1983.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, back when we were doing undisclosed dual agency, when you could get away with it back in the early 80s, remember?
Yeah, we are kind of secret agents, I guess. Uh, things just were much, much different. Just think of all the changes, Jeff, in 40 years that have went by.
Oh, it's amazing, from where we started to where we are today in the 2020s. It's really interesting. And what we're going to chat about today is the Maine Real Estate Brokerage Relationships Form. That showed up in the 90s, didn't it, Ed? Mid 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah, mid 90s. Yeah, we went through so many versions and so many different explanations. At one time, we didn't even explain it to anybody. We just handed it to them and hoped that they would read it and understand it. Now we're to a position where we need to provide it and explain it so our buyers and sellers in Maine make informed decisions based on the conversation that we would have with them. And we're going to get into this form a bit and talk about really the foundation of the whole relationship that we would have with a buyer and seller. It's really like the Miranda that the real estate we have, that the police have, the
Yeah.
Miranda of real estate.
Yeah, in this form, it's really geared, the purpose of the form is transparency, education and transparency. The law might tell us to furnish and or provide it, maybe the verbs in the law, but you see in all the education from the Real Estate Commission core courses through the programs that we offer at the Real Estate Learning Group, it's all about explanation and discussion, and if the consumers understand the relationships that we have, customers, clients, single agency, appointed agency, dual agency. If they understand how that all works, they'll make better informed decisions. And so we should be going over this real estate brokerage relationships form at the first substantive communication we have, either face to face or in writing with a consumer, potential seller, potential buyer. This form started in 1993, 1994, when we changed the license law to allow for buyer agency. It wasn't available before that, and they said, "Wait a minute, we're going to get into the difference between customers and clients, and we need to have that good conversation and transparency." So let's get into it. What's the first section of the form?
Well, Jeff, we want to begin with, you are now a customer. And what does that mean? Well, in Maine, Maine law provides again different levels for brokerage services. And we need to begin with this because that's the default of the relationship here in Maine, that a buyer or seller would be a customer. And as you can see, it shows what limits would
Yeah.
be there. We're not going to be representing that buyer or seller as an agent. They would be just a customer, unrepresented.
Yeah, and they're looking at, if you look at that first line, are you interested in buying or selling residential real estate in Maine? It's interesting because when you dig into the rule, in the law, you'll see that there is an exception if there's less than one residential unit or more than four, that there is an exception that this form would not have to be provided. I think that was a concession to the commercial lobby back in the 90s, and I'm here today to argue for doing this on every transaction, because no matter whether it has a residential component or not, a customer is a customer and a client's a client in the law. It doesn't matter. Commercial buyers, land buyers aren't different customers versus clients. And so we start with the default position of a customer, where the licensee, myself, doesn't represent the consumer. And as you see here in the bottom of this section, it says in bold down there, as a customer, you should not expect me to promote your best interest or to keep any information you give me confidential, including your bargaining position. And that's a big aha. And I think that's the reference to the Miranda that you were mentioning a moment ago. As a customer, what should they expect, Ed?
Yeah, as a customer, they should not expect us to keep our discussions confidential. We do need to provide them with honesty, both buyers and sellers. Also, we're going to be account or be responsible for money and or property that's in our possession. Those are some of the key factors as they're pointed out right in front of you on this slide.
And in that, we talked about doing this at the first substantive communication we have, either face to face or in writing. And face to face, it can be a conversation. In writing, it's a little bit tricky, excuse me, because you're providing them the form and you're asking them to read it on their own. And then I would assume that we have to find a way to follow up with them to confirm that they understand and what their choices are going to be. So when the face-to-face presentation is so much easier to make, and I kind of like to tick through. You heard me already. I changed the language there a little bit. I said, as a customer, you should not expect me to promote your best interest. Instead of the licensee in the third person, hey, they're talking to me. They're talking to you. Give it to them. Be very conversational. I kind of just tick down through it. Maine law requires us, to perform certain duties in dealing with buyers and sellers, and the disclose material defects related to the physical condition of the property. And as you said a moment ago, treat honestly and account for all monies and property. Tick through it and talk with them about it. And what I find is when I get to the as a customer, you should not expect me to promote your interest, their eyes start to change. The look in their face starts to change a little bit, doesn't it, Ed? I mean, do they ever ask you, what do they ask you when you give them that line?
Yeah, you're not going to represent me. You're not going to help me. Yeah, they're very concerned.
And it says, is there something else? I go, yeah, well, behind door number 2, which I'll go to in just a moment. But while we're here, I explain to customers, and I kind of feel free to use this and to embellish it a bit. Don't change the meaning of it, but if they say, well, tell me more about a customer. Well, customers, I don't perform I don't represent you. I'm not going to do an investigation. I don't do any inspections. I don't give you the benefit of any analyses that I might do, such as value opinions and neighborhoods and like that. I'm not going to do any I'm not going to do any investigation, and for a bonus today only, I'm not going to give you confidentiality, and some people you can talk with them like that. Other people, you just need to make sure that they really understand what a customer is, and they're going to ask you for an alternative, I would assume, right?
Right.
And that alternative, they'll say, hey, what's the next piece? And that would be that they could become a client in the transaction. And that client comes, as it says here, that agent-client relationship, in addition to the check marks that we have here of performing the terms of a written agreement, promoting the best interest of the seller, promoting the best interest of the buyer, maintain confidentiality. I kind of like to go a little bit further than that too, and some of the other things, and talk about the value that you have and the other things that you'll do with them as a client. Have you ever done anything like that, Ed?
It depends on the client. I would say yes, because they want to hear more. And, this again sets that whole foundation for the relationship going forward. They want your help, but they're going to start to ask questions, pretty soon about, well, do I have to sign something?
Yeah.
All right.
And in that, when you get to that part of it, they're going to ask, and they're, before they even get to that part, what they're wondering is, I think they kind of like when I start talking about a client about providing reasonable care and diligence to disclose anything that's material to the transaction, to act in their best interest, to put their interest ahead of my own loyalty.
Yep.
to be observant of their lawful, obedient to their lawful instructions. That all is wonderful. They all love that, and they say, "Hey, how do I become a client?" That's the goal of this conversation for me, is this transparency. And given the nature of the transaction, they're going to want client level service. They're not going to want no confidentiality, no inspection, no analysis. They're going to want reasonable care and diligence to disclose and confidentiality. What do you think, Ed?
Well, I agree. They're definitely going to want, they want you as an agent.
Yeah,
They really do.
yeah,
They're just not real sure about how all this works. So we want to kind of get into the details with them. And if we do a good job explaining this, the
yeah,
next documents that we have to go to will be a cinch, okay?
yeah, yeah.
Because they're already wanting the next documents by the time we get done.
What I find here before I go to single agency versus appointed agency, what we want to emphasize here on this one is that this is the point where they say, okay, well, I think I like client level service better. And then we
Mhm.
have to remember that in Maine, the law requires a written agreement for there to be an agent-client relationship. And
Yeah.
so they're still engaged with me, and then I show them a written agreement for client level service, and they're looking and they're going, well, wait a minute, this one's got a little bit more commitment than I'm asking for, because maybe I showed them a 6 month exclusive agreement before I've even shown them any property, for example, on the buy side of the transaction. It's the commitment, I think,
Mm.
to an extended period of time when they really don't know you well yet, that causes them not to sign for client, and then it locks them into the customer relationship. Have you ever heard of that like that before, Ed?
Oh, absolutely. They really are concerned about that. And we talk more about all the other options that you can provide to that buyer, especially not maybe such a long period of time. There's
Yeah.
a non-exclusive, there's a, just for one property. Well, somehow we really, in their best interest, need to come up with a written agreement that everybody can sign so we can provide that client level services, which is what they really want.
Yeah, it's to put their interest in sync with the agreement that we have. And instead of just maybe presenting an exclusive for an extended period of time, not getting that from the consumer and then ending up with a customer, maybe consider, if you run into that objection, is to go and limit that exclusive in some way to maybe a specific property that you're going to show them, or a specific day on the calendar, today and tomorrow while they're here this weekend. Or actually, they have non-exclusive forms available in the marketplace, that you can use, that actually it would attach only to property when you show it to them. If you show it to them, then they're working with you. If you're not showing it to them, they can feel free to work with somebody else. So it allows you then to have that client level agreement. Because my big aha for me a long time ago was, they're not they're not they're not rejecting client level service. They are adverse to the commitment when they really don't know you well and they want to try you on a little bit. So I kind of go for the non-exclusive agreement. Yeah.
Yeah, a good option. Absolutely.
Talk
Yeah.
about what's next on the level is the type of agency relationship that different companies have, and in working, with agents of different companies. And I think consumers look at you, and maybe they say, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to hire you and your company to represent me. And it's not always that case. That's the single agency option there, right? Where every licensee represents every client of the agency. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and typically I find that's being a lot like small agencies, mom and pop type agencies. Sometimes, you'll see a larger company with single agency, but it's usually, only a few people.
Yes, and in Maine, I mean, companies that don't have, you have to have at least three agents at a company to do appointed agency. The default position in the license law is single agency. You never see it, and it's interesting. The only place that you really see the term single agency is here in this real estate brokerage relationships form. Those words don't exist in the law and the rule. It's the default position that when the consumer hires a real estate broker, they're hiring the entire agency and they're hiring every licensee at that agency unless the agency has a policy where they appoint individual licensees to represent a client to the exclusion of everybody else, as it says here on this slide. So if we have an appointed agency, when Ed Getty is the appointed agent, Ed's the only one that is representing that consumer, is the way I understand it.
Yes, I do too. And, that's some of the things that we need to be very clear about, with each buyer and seller. They
Yeah.
have no idea what type of agency relationship they're even available and which ones we have available from our company unless we explain it to them.
And the reason you go, well, why is this important? Well, once again, back to that theme of transparency. I think it's important for the consumer to know that if they speak with me at the agency, that under appointed agency, I'm the only one that represents them. So they should not speak with other licensees at my company the way they would with me. Don't share confidential information with other licensees because they don't represent them, and vice versa under single agency, that every licensee represents every client of the company. And then that creates some interesting situations where a licensee maybe has no direct knowledge of all of the clients of the company. And it's important for them to understand that.
Yep, very true.
So this slide here talks about dual agency, and then it goes into the next section on dual agent. And in certain situations, there's a policy option for companies to allow or not allow disclosed dual agency, right?
Yep. And you can see some limits there. And we get into a lot deeper conversation here because I think it's a little confusing to the consumer.
Yeah.
They're not quite sure how that works. And actually at this particular time, we're talking about in theory that if this happens, right, Jeff?
Yeah. And so what we do, we have whole classes in this in disclosed dual agency. We have a whole course in that. There's a lot to it, but there's a yes or no box. Any company that has the option of consumers choosing to allow for disclosed dual, we go over a disclosure with them, and there's a yes or no box. Are they going to accept it or are they not going to accept it? And it's an interesting scenario because as a disclosed dual agent, I serve two masters. I have two clients. I have a client seller and a client buyer. Under appointed agency, disclosed dual is for the individual licensee that represents more than one agent, more than one consumer. Under single agency, it's a little different because every licensee represents every client. And so if you had a buyer client that wanted to buy a seller client's property at the agency level and they did not do disclosed dual, then there'd have to be a referral to another company of one of the consumers, or there would have to be a change from client to customer of one of those consumers. And this yes or no decision comes down to, for me, it's always come down to the type of material fact information that exists in the transaction. Because when you look into this, there's four exceptions here. Those four exceptions: willingness to accept less, willingness, disclosure of willingness to pay more, confidential negotiating strategy, and motivation. Those are the only things that a dual agent will not disclose to all of their clients. So if I have two clients in a transaction, I must disclose to both clients everything that's relative to relevant to the transaction, except the seller's willingness to take less, the buyer's willingness to pay more, their strategy or their motivation. Am I on to something there, Ed, with that?
Yeah, yeah. And it's a type of limited agency by just these limits. They get all of the other fiduciary duties as a client.
Yep.
And, sometimes it's, as a dual agent, sometimes it can be difficult, as you mentioned, Geoff, the fact pattern of the transaction. Who are these buyers and sellers? What relationships are out there, which may make this somewhat difficult?
When you mentioned the word limited, and I think we ought to just highlight that for a moment, because when you look at the disclosure, the dual agent disclosure required in the license law and rule, it says right in there that the agency's duties are limited. And the specific duties that are typically limited are obedience and confidentiality. If the seller has information that they don't want disclosed, such as the fact that there's a solar farm going in next door or something, if they don't want that disclosed, then they might not want me to represent another buyer. The material fact information, information that would influence a client to whom it's imparted. If I have two clients, I've got a lot to disclose to everybody. And I must disclose it to both sides, except these four exclusions here at the bottom of this slide.
Yep, very true. And it's that you must do that.
Yeah.
And if one client or the other doesn't want you to do that, then we would need to revisit that that authority.
So that's a yes or no conversation, but we need to give examples, and we need to, what I have found be very helpful as we move on is that, what material fact information is there that one client does not want disclosed. That's going to really inform the yes or no decision that we have.
Yeah, and I think also the participants too. What relationship do we have here? Am I serving as a disclosed dual agent and the buyer is my mother?
Yeah.
That could be a problem with the seller.
Yeah. And it very much so.